Hey guys, Crewcaster here. For today, we're going to talk about something that is going to be changing the meta for PSO2 New Genesis, and that is the addition of new fixas into the game. So from before, we've had Fatal Fixa, Termina, and Attack for weapons, and then a few others for armors that were mainly like to deal with PP recovery or defensive-wise. But now we received 6 new fixes, 4 for weapons and 2 for armor that can change up how much DPS that we're doing throughout the game. Starting off with the weapons, we have a Fixa Blastor, so a little Nerf Blaster Fixa, where it's a little bit less potency than the Attack Fixa by 0.25% potency for the respective levels, but then it has a sub-potency for Photon Blast. So this is 12% at level 3, but at level 5 it gets up to 15%, which is pretty big. So for this, it's pretty straightforward. It just increases your Photon Blast potency way more, but it's a little bit of a sacrifice with the regular potency. Then we have Fixa Wix. This gives you extra potency against weak points. So this is going to be very nice for pretty much every boss encounter, especially those that have a weak point the entire time. But then it also has a flat 2% bonus to regular potency against everything, even non-weak points. It's kind of like a Fixa Attack 1, but has a way higher potency specific to weak points. Next, we have something pretty similar, but it's just the opposite, which is Fixa Unwix. So this has that 2% flat potency for all of its levels, but then it has a potency to non-weak points. This is going to be higher than the weak point version, because already at level 1 it's plus 5%. But that's because weak points already have a multiplier that lets you do more damage. This is going to be good when you're just facing a ton of like mobs that don't have weak points, or bosses that don't really have a weak point either. Then for the last one, we have the Fixa Abandac. So this one is basically just a straight up better version of Fixa Attack, because it gives a flat 2% potency like the last two Fixas, but every single augment type you have gives even more potency on top. And even with just like having 6 augments, like only 6 different types with the current 6 slots, you can get more than a Fixa Attack of the same level. So for here, for instance, you got the 2%, and then if you had 6 here, this would go up to 2.7. So adding that together, that would be 4.7. However, this isn't exactly how it adds up because they are separate instances of potency. So they actually multiply together. So for that example that I just gave with the 2.7, it actually multiplies with the 2% to give you 4.754%. So it's a little bit more than 4.7. And if you get bigger instances, it's going to be a bigger difference there. This goes for all of the new fixes. The Fixa Unwix, that multiplies together with that, at least for that certain case. Same with the Fixa Wix, and the same for the Fixa Blastor, where it multiplies into the Photon Blast potency. Back with the Abandac, though, to maximize its potency here, you need to use 20 different augment types to get to that top number for any level of Abandac. So that means if you want to get to that, you're going to have to not use all just best in slot augs or the same augs throughout your entire weapon and armor pieces. So you may want to switch them up a little bit to get even more potency. An example is like with a 3% aug, it might be best not to just have another of the same on an armor piece, and instead use like a doable which has 2.75%, because you would get this bonus to proc again, which would actually exceed that 3%. We'll be testing most of these though, so you know exactly what they do, because some of them, even though they might seem straightforward, don't actually work probably the way that you think. But moving on to the armors, there are 2 fixes. Fixa Orgsys, which this gives Photon Blast gauge charge when attacking. So every time you attack, you get a little bit to your PB, which this will just increase that amount every time. I believe at level 5, this goes up to 10% and starts at 4% with level 1. Then for the Fixa Increza, this is pretty much the same, but with natural Photon Blast gauge charge. So when you're just existing, the PB also gets charged, and that'll just increase that amount. And I believe this also goes up to 10% at level 5. Right now, we have most of the information on the levels of these fixes, like Unwix goes up to 15% potency on non-weak points, Blastor 15% with the PBs, and then Abandac goes up to 10% with 0.5% per augment type. Before the armors, there isn't really any information known at this moment. At level 3, I had 8% with the Photon Blast gauge charge, but usually with level 4 and 5 of Fixas, they drop off. So that's why I'm thinking 2% from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, but then once it's at that 8%, it only gets 1%, going to 9 at 4, and then 10% at 5. Before we go into the testing of these, from what I understand, how you obtain all of these fixes, the only way to get them is through dropping it in certain content. There's nothing that you can do with the Fixa enhancement system in the item lab to be able to randomly generate them. It has to be dropped. So for right now, you can get it in the Sonic limited time quest that's available for this week. So maybe other limited time quests in the future will be able to have it too. And then also the Darkfall Solace 4-man and 8-man versions. So that's right now the only ways to obtain them, but maybe also, besides LTQs, you could get it in the other Darkfall Solace quest coming in December. There is another spot that I've seen these fixes occur, and that's from the 10-star drops in the Tem defense, which has a chance of it being dropped in there. But none of the other gear in this quest can give those fixes, unlike the Sonic LTQ or Darkfall Solace. So just keep that in mind. So it may be like some content after a certain rarity, like 10 stars, will always be able to have the fixes moving forward, but then like specific content can drop it for all of its drops. Another weird thing with these fixes is when you try to transfer them into something else, an error will pop up when you try to do so. There was a connection error returning to lab selection screen. I've never seen this before, but it only applies to these new fixes, so maybe you can't even end up transferring them, but it also may just be a bug that needs to be fixed later. For enhancing these though, if you already have them on, you can use other fixes of the same weapon type to try to increase it to higher levels. It's just going to be still that 10% chance, unless if you use some sort of booster. Now though, let's get into the testing of these fixes. The only one that I'm not going to test is this Fixa Blastor, because this one is literally straightforward, just extra potency with your Photon Blast, but everything else works a little bit differently than what you would think. Let's start off with the Fixa Unwix. This is the one with the extra potency to non-weak points and has that flat 2% potency. So to compare this, we have to use a Fixa Attack 1, which also has that 2% potency. To actually test this, we're going to be looking for critical hits with the same exact attack. Because every time you do a critical hit, that always nets you the max damage that attack can do. With the Fixa Unwix, we see that we get a crit of 764, so with the Fixa Attack, we should see a lower number. We end up getting a 727, so that actually checks out. But now let's try it with a Blight round to see if that counts as a weak point or not. So we're going to put that on, and we see eventually that with the Fixa Attack, we get an 873, and so does the Fixa Unwix. So that means the weak bullet counts as a weak point. That's not all though. Let's actually try this out with a elemental weakness as well. These targets have weakness to all elements, so any will apply. And when we do the FOE against this with both Fixa Attack and Fixa Unwix, we end up with the same exact number. Unfortunately for Fixa Unwix, anything that is under this part boost section, so elemental weakness, weak point, enhancer, blight rounds, the reinforced blight rounds, all of that are considered weak points to the game. That means you won't get the extra potency off of the Fixa Unwix. That makes this Unwix very niche to use. You can't have any blight rounds on the enemy, you can't be using techniques or elemental damage against the weakness of the enemy, and you can't be hitting the usual weak points. So basically, the only things that you're really going to be wanting to use this for are for enemies that have like no weak points at all, so maybe like Bujin for instance, and you're also not a ranger or a technique user. With all that said, that means all of these things will work though with the Fixa Wix. So this gives the extra damage against weak points, so that means it should work against the blight rounds and the elemental damage weakness too. But let's check this out with the no weak points at first, just to double check that it doesn't actually do extra damage against nothing, and we do find in fact that it will be the same damage numbers. With the blight round, we end up getting a 618 with the Fixa Attack, and then for the Fixa Wix, we do get a 643. So that means it does work against blight rounds, and then later we find that with the elemental damage weakness, we do find a similar pattern. So because of that, you'll find way more opportunities to be able to use the Fixa Wix than you would the Unwix. And even though the Fixa Unwix gets up to 15% extra potency versus the 5% on the Wix here at level 5, hitting a weak point gives you, at least with a natural one, the 1.5 times multiplier, and then the other weaknesses have 1.2 or the 1.25. So that compounded together with this extra damage is just going to outshine the Unwix in almost all scenarios. Let's move to the testing of the Abandac now. For the thing here, the question is, what does it mean by an augment type? Is it just the naming of the augment? Is it the actual categories of the augment? Let's figure that out. At first, I started with the relic weapon that I have the Abandac on, which has a precision 1 on it as well, and then have 2 gold prim armors, both with the Endemio augment on them. I end up getting a crit of 565, so let's see what happens when I take off one of those armors that have an Endemio on it. As expected, we'll see that it has the same exact damage as we just took away an augment that did no potency and was the same name and category of something else. But then I removed the armors completely just to see if my damage would be affected from augments on the armors, and my damage does go down to 563, so it did have some impact. For my final test of this, I ended up putting a precision 2 on one of the armor pieces and equipping that with the relic that has a precision 1 on it. So the precision 1 and precision 2 are in the same exact category, but technically they have different names. So if it works, then it's based off naming. If it doesn't work, then it's based off category. And it ends up actually working, giving me an extra 3 damage up to 568. What this means is that to maximize out this damage here while also not sacrificing anything, you can have like separate types of XD augments, for instance. So the XD Spimel Tech will give me a bonus of that 0.45% on this level 4, but then also I can get that bonus from the XD style Mel Tech since they're differently named. So ultimately I'll get this bonus twice for the same category of augment. The same could be said for all of the trippable capsules. So if I had a Spirit trippable here, a Stamina one here, and a Guard one over here, I would get that bonus 3 separate times. An example build of how to like maximize the Abandac's potency might look something like this, where you have like the usual best in slot on one of the pieces of gear, but then you might start using like LC augs on something else, even S augments if you can get those, because those are also considered differently named augments within the game. Having like different kinds of trippables, maybe throwing on different kinds of augments, so instead of like Grand Dreadkeeper on everything, you would have like the High Red Domina on there and the High L Domina on another, to try to get as much as you can to get to that 20 limit. Yeah, with something like this, you're actually not really losing out on much potency within the augments themselves, and overall gaining more than if you did do it this way. Like with the LC Augs, it's a little bit less, 0.25% less potency for each one that you do, but because you're overall getting more with a high Fixa Abandac, like 0.45% with this level 4, or 0.5% with a level 5, it's going to exceed just putting on another of a best in slot if it doesn't give you that extra bonus with an Abandac. Unfortunately, as a side effect of this is going to be way easier for a whale player to do all of this because of the XD augments for every single one, as well as the S augments that you get out of AC packs, SG packs, or support scratches. So a free-to-play player is going to have a much harder time to be able to fill each of those separate 20 named augments. Eventually, though, this will become easier to do as we get more slots available to us, like the slot 7 and slot 8 in our pieces, and just when more augments come out that are named differently. Regardless of that, though, I think the Abandac is the best out of the 4 here, because even if you don't maximize its potency, let's say you have 10 different named augments, that would give you 5% at the level 5. And that is equal to the Fixa Wix's level 5 with 5% potency here. But it's not specific to weak points or non-weak points like these two. It can be used against anything with any attack. The only other one that I would consider using in the best case scenario is the Fixa Blastor to switch to it when I want to do a Photon Blast. And then I would switch back to the Abandac for the rest of the fight until I get another Photon Blast to come up, just switching on and off there. When you compare these to the previous fixes that have already existed, Fixa Attack is pretty much phased out at this point. Like, it's probably still better than Fixa Unwix and Fixa Blastor majority of the time, but with Fixa Abandac and Fixa Wix, these are just going to excel over that. With Fixa Fatale and Termina, it's going to be dependent still on the weapons that you have. I think Fatale is going to be falling off more in comparison to, like, Fixa Abandac, but with Fixa Termina, this is going to be really dependent on how much crit rate that you have. Like with Verschmells, Fixa Termina is still going to be the best in slot for you. With other things, it's going to depend on how your crit rate adds up. Going back to the armor fixas, the Fixa Orgsys is probably going to be the best in slot for you DPS-wise, and then Increza second best, because natural rate isn't as good as when you are attacking for your gauge charge. But this allows you to get more PBs, which allows you to do more damage over the course of longer fights. But you could still consider using the other fixas, because maybe your class is photon power hungry, so you'd want like Perform Enthusia or Natura. Or if you just want to take less damage, you would still use Fixa Guards. That is pretty much everything that I have, though, on these new fixes. I think, personally, they're going to completely change the meta of the game, especially when they become more available. Like with the Abandac having all those different kinds of augments for the different pieces to worry about, the situational stuff with the Fixa Wix and the Unwix, and then using this for PBs and switching on and off. And even with the armor ones, like maybe having too much of this would be a bad thing, because you can only Photon Blast so often, because the PB does have a cooldown. So maybe you want a variety of Orgsys, and then maybe some other like PP consumption reduction with Performa. Let me know what you guys think of all of these fixes. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.